Welcome to the News Hour. The Biden administration today unveiled a new set of sanctions against Russia to punish it further for the full-scale invasion of Ukraine that began 2 years ago tomorrow.
The sanctions are also meant to target Russia for the death of anti-corruption activist and politician Alexei Navalny. He died in an Arctic prison 1 week ago from a cause still unknown. Earlier today, I spoke to Senator Secretary of State for Political Affairs Victoria Nuland about the state of the war years on. Victoria Nuland is back to the News Hour. As the world prepares to mark the second anniversary of Putin's Ukrainian invasion, Ukraine's counteroffensive, Ukraine lost a brutal long battle for Ampim. Additional funding, as you well know, is stuck in the GOP-led House, and Russia is showing no signs of quitting. What is the outlook for Ukraine right now?
Well, Jeff, you're
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll get started in just a few seconds. Bear with us.
and as you said, they've had to come out of Avdiivka. When I was out there a couple of weeks ago, there were soldiers on the front line with only 20 bullets a day to defend themselves. And this is one.
Okay. All right, Dr. Professor Ampim, we made you a co-host.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I appreciate that. I just checked it out, so I'm ready. My files are good.
Okay, let's give it a minute or two more.
Okay.
Trying to set it up. So when I'm muted, is that when you see a microphone in a line? Do it? That means they can't hear me. Okay.
That means we can hear you. We can hear you. I can mute you if you like.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get started. And have a very honored and esteemed guest joining us today. And Dr. Ampim, I know he is a first-hand researcher, which means he like to get on the ground and get out the first accurate documents. We probably don't need to get him started on that. And I was actually listening to Dr. Ampim on the Carl Nelson show, and something else you don't want to get him started about is Carter G. Woodson, which is a fascinating discussion in itself for Black History Month. And so we have reached out. He's with Advancing the Research now, and at several universities. I want to say it's two, Merritt College and Costa in California.
Yes.
And so we're going to stop babbling. We're just going to turn it right over to one of our preeminent historians in not only America, but the whole world, Professor Manu Ampim. Thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Brother Eric. I appreciate it. I want to thank Eric Atkins and the Unity Group for asking me to share a little bit of my primary research on the revolutionary Dr. King. And I promise you that what I'm going to share, most of it will be new because I want to share with you the records. And so, and then I'll leave some time for dialogue and questions. But one of the things that has motivated me to present on Dr. King is this is part of a long journey. I started some decades ago, and I did my graduate thesis on the revolutionary Martin Luther King Jr., and I found some extraordinary records and documents, and also interviewed people who were working in the movement at the time. And there was one aha moment after another. So I want to share just a little bit of it with you, and I guarantee that what most people in the country think about Dr. King has almost nothing to do with the accurate or the complete record. So it's not to dismiss what people tend to know. It's just that the propaganda is pretty extraordinary. So I'm going to share some slides in order to give you some insight of what I'm talking about, and then at the end we'll have time to dialogue, because there's nothing more important than to get your feedback and input about this topic. So I'm going to address the revolutionary Dr. King, the evolution of a revolutionary. And this is very important that we look at his evolutionary development as a political activist. And I've been working on the King project now since 1987. I'm not actively working on it now, but that's when I really started to go to the records. So I looked at all of his press conferences, his speeches, his interviews, his articles, his books, his sermons, as well as the copious records that are part of the FBI archives. They have extensive archives on Dr. King because he's the most surveillance man in the history of the country. There's nobody that was more surveillanced than Dr. King. So I'll share that with you and present some ideas that I think will be intriguing. But as our brother said, we can't share anything in February without honoring the man who's the reason for the season, and that is Dr. Carter G. Woodson. He's the one that had the vision back in 1926 to establish a special time to deal with African American and Black international achievements, accomplishments, and contributions to the world. And that's what February was about. It started as a week, but he envisioned an entire year to put back the missing pages, the missing chapters, and the missing volumes of U.S. and world history in order to make the record complete. So in terms of Woodson, one of the great educators of his time, historian, wrote more than a dozen books. He created an organization to help facilitate his work. Now it's called the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. But he also created and edited different volumes, like the journal. Now it's called the Journal of African American History. He had his own publishing house to make sure nobody can edit his work, but he also founded a bulletin to make sure teachers were informed. So that week in 1926 became a month 50 years later, but it is accurately and should be called African Heritage Month, because Woodson focused a lot of the achievement of Black people on Africa. His last two books were on Africa. He wrote about Africa throughout his entire career. So when Woodson, in fact, his last article series, he just called it Egypt, to deal with African contributions in Kemet, or as you know, in Egypt. But he's more focused on achievements more and more, not just in the U.S., but on the African continent. So it's important to accurately conceptualize and frame the work of Woodson, and because he focused on it, these accomplishments in a context where Africa is front and center. But we don't have time to share that with you today, but we want to give you some insight about the revolutionary Dr. King. And I've argued, and you let me know if I make the case, that Dr. King is the most misrepresented and misunderstood political figure in U.S. history. What we think we know about King is opposite of the facts and the details. It just shows how cunning and careful and effective the media and biographers and journalists and others have been to misrepresent his legacy. So people get emotional when you tell them that their ideas about King are not consistent with the record, but how could someone make an argument when they haven't gone to the text? They haven't gone to the record. People have not read Dr. King's books. Most people don't even know how many books he read, and they surely have not read the books. So it's impossible for someone to take a strong position on something that they haven't even looked into very carefully. So he wrote 5 books. Stride Towards Freedom was the first one. This was after the Montgomery bus boycott. Then he wrote Why We Can't Wait, because people were saying that, Dr. King, you're a troublemaker. Why don't you just let time solve the problem? Because they say time heals all wounds, they say. And they said that, King, you're just coming into our towns making racial problems. And King came up with a better argument. He said time is neutral. It can be used effectively or ineffectively. It's just that the people of ill will, the negative people, use time far more effectively than those of goodwill. Then he came out with a tremendous title, Why We Can't Wait. And he was a minister. So he wrote Strength to Love. He also gave 5 lectures in Canada called the Massey Lectures. And so he turned those 5 lectures in Canada in 1967 into his 4th book, A Trumpet of Conscience. And his last book, which people, if they don't know of the other ones, they may know and they're aware of where do we go from here, chaos or community. This was the last book. So this is 5 books, but Dr. King was on the case, traveling 325,000 miles a year, giving speeches, involved in rallies, doing interviews. There's tons of records. So this is why I had to go to the archives and go to the records to look at the original sources on Dr. King. And now one book I would add to the list, he did not write this book, but it's probably outside of his own writing. A Testament of Hope is the best public book available on Dr. King because James Washington edited materials of King going back to 1957 until he passed. So there's some posthumous materials that were published a year after he passed away. So that was in 1969. Things came out, including a tremendous article on A Testament of Hope. And so now, those are the 5 books he wrote, and I put in the Testament of Hope. Now, if you looked at King, or if you went online, you might find another book. And it's very difficult for someone to come up with the 5 books that he wrote. It is, because you'll come up with all kinds of other books that he didn't write. And here's one of them. Here's one of the most, let me show you why it is. I'm laying the framework here, the foundation, why it is that King is so misrepresented. Take a look at this book. When I saw this, after I spent thousands of hours, literally thousands of hours, combing through all the original records, I was in Barnes and Nobles and I was shocked. I said, how in the world could I have gone through all of these records, all of the details, and have missed his autobiography? I'm saying, man, damn, how did that happen? I said, no, there's no way. There's no way he wrote an autobiography or was thinking about it. So I was nervous. I was at Barnes and Nobles. I started to pace when I saw this. I said, man, all these years was for naught. I would have missed one of the key books. And I said, okay, edited by Claiborne Carson. So I approached the book a little bit nervous. So let me take a look at it. And sure enough, guess what? Guess what? This is not a book written by Dr. King. The problem with this title, and Dr. Claiborne Carson, a scholar, he knows better. But people are so apt to misrepresent King that they violate all ethical and academic standards. This is not the autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. Not at all. In fact, what it really is the selected writings that were chosen by Claiborne Carson and the late Coretta Scott King. They decided to take certain speeches and to take certain sermons and to take certain articles and certain materials and selectively present to the public, not the autobiography of Martin Luther King, because auto means self and biography means story. So when someone writes an autobiography, that's their self story. Nobody can write your self story. You may can dictate it to them and they can write it, but guess what? Dr. King never had any intentions of writing an autobiography. He never set aside any material for an autobiography. He never told anybody that he was considering an autobiography. This was concocted by Claiborne Carson at Stanford, along with the late Coretta Scott King, so they can misrepresent Dr. King's legacy. Why not simply be honest and call it the selected writings of Dr. King, and not the autobiography, but simply the what? The biography, the story of Martin Luther King. How in the world can somebody write this man's autobiography 30 years after he passed away? This is why I was so shocked in 1998 when I saw this. And when I looked in it, guess what? There's not a single word or suggestion that Dr. Carson or the late Coretta Scott King, that anybody had any idea or any information, any evidence at all that Dr. King had some intentions or was leaning towards an autobiography. He was not concerned about that. That was put together for marketing reasons and to peddle to the public a title which is dishonest. Just call it the selected writings of Dr. King or the authentic biography, but it cannot and is not the autobiography. But that's what happens when people are just able to carte blanche misrepresent somebody else's life story. So this is as I suspected. I was a little nervous that day, but as I suspected, this could not have been. There's no possible way I could have missed this because I was careful in spending hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours going through the record. Now, Dr. King, these are his dates, and he's assassinated on April 4th, 1968. And for us to understand King, a few things that need to happen. I argued that there should be a shift from his birthday to his death day. Well, what do you mean? Well, we talk about his birthday on January 15th, and there's nothing unusual about a cuddly black baby born in Atlanta in the 1920s. Nothing unusual about that. But if you look at the course of Dr. King's life and what he lived for and what he stood for and ultimately what he died for, then it raises some very important and troubling questions about why was he assassinated and how was it that that the government was intimately involved in this. So the death day is very important. So we should shift our gaze to April 4th, and people will be very uncomfortable. That's why most don't do that. What's also important, we have to go to the sources, the original sources, because right now it's biographers who are telling King's story, and King would not even recognize his own legacy the way it's presented now in 2024. And then, of course, there must be an understanding of King's shift, a careful examination of his shift from civil rights to human rights. He's not even dealing with civil rights in the second phase of his political career. And he certainly is involved with and advocating human rights and also the acquisition of power. He started to advocate Black power. Oh, yes, he did. Now, the difference between civil rights and human rights is civil rights are rights that are given within a particular society. So governments bestow civil rights, the right to vote, the right to hold office. Those are civil rights. But human rights are higher than that. Human rights are rights that we have just because we're born. As it says, human rights, or the rights of human beings, the right to life, the right to safety. Those are human rights. The right to healthcare, even though the U.S. doesn't agree with that, the world does. But human rights is what King embraced. So now here's what was surprising to me initially when I began to do my systematic primary work on Dr. King, is that he divided the Black struggle into two periods. And you never see this anywhere because the biographers know exactly what they're doing as they move the public further and further away from the original evidence. According to Dr. King, he said the first period and the second period, as he described as the civil rights period and human rights period, these are the years that he gave to it. So 1954, that was the Brown versus Board of Education decision that desegregated the public school system. So in the first period, or what King called the civil rights period, he sometimes used 1954, sometimes 1955. He said that 54, with the Brown decision, was the legal turning point. But he said laws declare rights, but they don't deliver the rights. The people themselves have to go out and act. So sometimes you'll see him using 1955 as the beginning of the first period because he said that was the psychological turning point. The psychological turning point. So with the Montgomery bus boycott. Anyway, in this civil rights period, these are the issues that King addressed with his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He thought that if you taught and presented moral issues, then white people would change once they saw the error of their ways. He did focus on integration, protest, all the things that you see there, reform. The dream has been distorted because soon after he started talking about the dream, he's consistently talked about the American nightmare. And he also embraced nonviolence. But what most people think they know about Dr. King is not consistent with the full record. Now, what happens is that once the Civil Rights Bill was passed in 64 and the Voting Rights Bill was passed in 1965, King and his organization said that in a sense, Congress has signed the civil rights movement out of existence. In other words, they've met the legal goals that were part of this reform period. But the Voting Rights Bill was passed in August of 1965, August 1965. Soon after that, Dr. King started to turn towards the issue of human rights. And this is what he focused on in late 65 and 66 and 67 and 68, when the hot coals hit his lips and he started condemning everybody and condemned the US government. This is what gets erased from the record. So in the human rights period, as he called it, I'm not defining this, I'm simply reflecting what Dr. King called it. He said it was a structural problem. Dr. King called for Black power. He said there was nothing wrong with acquiring power, and that's one of the problems. We need power in order to control our communities. He argued that. He also started to look at not just local concerns, but national and international concerns. In the second period, he more openly, he did it in the civil rights period, the first period, but in the second period, he more openly embraced armed liberation struggles. And he's talking more and more about the nightmare. He quoted Lacy Hughes about what happens to a dream deferred. He says not just deferred, these dreams have been repudiated by a racist system. And if you heard a lot of what Dr. King said, you would say that that must be Malcolm. No, that's Dr. King. But people have been taken away from, we have as the public, from the record. So it's always two main periods. It's the first period of civil rights and human rights, or the second period, and this is rarely discussed, rarely. Now, here's arguably the most popular speech in the history of the US, the I Have a Dream speech that he gave in DC on the Mall, and you see the date. This is arguably the most famous speech, not of just Dr. King, but one of the most famous speeches in the history of the US, and to show you how effectively Dr. King has been completely misrepresented. He's gone from being a practical activist to an abstract dreamer. I remember when I was in Baltimore, for example, one of the teachers was on the radio, WEAA, that was Morgan State University's station, and the teacher, he was teaching third graders. He said he had all of the third graders draw a picture of Dr. King as they saw him. So one of the girls, he said, drew a picture of Dr. King lying in bed. He said, baby, why'd you draw a picture of him lying in bed? He said, well, he had a dream, so I thought he must have been asleep. And it's like, wow, but that's an accurate interpretation. So the propagandists are very effective. People don't know what Dr. King was about. They're talking about an abstract dream without a plan or program. And so you got a lot of young people and some activists in the community that are so divorced from reality that they think that Dr. King was soft. They think that Dr. King didn't do anything. They dismiss Dr. King's work because they don't know anything about Dr. King. So here, as an example, arguably one of the most famous speeches in the history of America, and yet most people don't know that King and the other activists were in Washington, DC, as he said, to dramatize a shameful condition. It's a 16-minute speech, and for the first 12 minutes, Dr. King condemned racists. He condemned America. He said that we've come here to not only dramatize a shameful condition, but 100 years after the so-called Emancipation Proclamation, Black people are not free. And they were there in DC for jobs and freedom, not to talk about an abstract dream. So he talks for 12 minutes, a stunning indictment of white America and the US government system. But as a leader, you can't leave people on a down note or a sour note. So the last few minutes, Dr. King said, despite these problems, I still have a dream that one day the country can change. And that's where the media steps in, right there, when he's talking about a dream to completely distort the purpose of the speech and the purpose of the entire march when they had about 250,000 people. So most people, for example, they don't know that he's condemning racists in the speech. And by the way, those who argue that Dr. King, he's soft or he didn't do this and that, tell them to not spread misinformation. It's very important to challenge people so that they're not a part of the information viruses that are out there. We know about a computer virus, and we certainly know about the coronavirus. But I'm here to tell you that there's also information viruses that are viral and very destructive. And this is why Dr. King is so misrepresented, because the media and the biographers have been very effective at propaganda. Take a look at the fact that Dr. King condemned police brutality not once, but twice in the speech. This is not even his most radical material. But take a look at what he actually says. And by the way, I'm going to show some text, more text than I normally would, because there's always somebody that says it ain't so. So documentation beats conversation. So I'm going to show you more text than I normally would, because I know that you're there. And also, the video is going to go out. I want to make sure that we disarm the myth makers up front. So look at what he says in the speech. There are those who are actually the devotees of civil rights. Quote, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. Who's read that? Who's heard that? You can hear the speech. He's clear about it, but he doesn't only mention it there. Dr. King also condemns police brutality a second time in the speech. He says, some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. How about that? This does not go out to the public. And the public is so tired of hearing about some abstract dream that they haven't even gone to the text to read the speech. So you can go to AmericanRhetoric.com and you can get not only the audio of the speech, but you can get the accurate transcript. And there's many people who distort King. So that's one thing. Now, what about the shift from civil rights to human rights? What were the factors that shifted Dr. King to a more radical position? And keep in mind, he was assassinated at the age of 39. So he was still evolving and growing, just like anybody else who was active in the movement. One of the factors were the liberation movements throughout the world. Dr. King embraced these liberation movements and publicly called for their support. And he was active with the revolutionaries in Africa. There's a lot of correspondence between King and people that were in the field fighting for their freedom. Not protesting, but fighting, like the Mau Mau in Kenya, revolutionaries in Zimbabwe and South Africa. King was in constant correspondence with them. So he embraced these liberation movements because he said that as a minister, he was concerned about the least of these. And King said that the colonialism in these parts of the world was the same as the internal colonialism here in the US. He said at root, these are the same struggle. He made no separation, no distinction. This gets overlooked and ignored and dismissed and suppressed because, again, people haven't gone to the record. And the media has been very effective to make sure people don't have an incentive. Now, after the voting rights bill was passed in 65 and the laws were on the books, then King left the South and started to organize in Chicago, in the Chicago Freedom Movement. This is what expanded the struggle from just the Southern area. So it's very important to look at what Dr. King and his organization were doing in Chicago in 1966. It's a more radical King. It's a different King. It's a different program, a different mission, a different understanding of how to get to the heart of the problem in America. Most examples that we get there are not about Chicago because they blow up most of the misinformation. He's there dealing with human rights, as he said, and also with Black Power. And he mentions that. Now, the rise of the Black Power movement took place in June of 1966. This is what split the movement. So all of the civil rights groups that worked together, that had a pact that they would always be nonviolent, that they would always focus on integration and Black and white together, that blew up in June of 1966, where the Meredith March against fear, it turned into the Black Power March. It split the movement. The NAACP left the march. The Urban League, they left. The activists like the late John Lewis, he left his own organization. He wasn't a part of SNCC anymore. He didn't agree with that. So a lot of the more conservative people, they left the movement, and those that pushed the Black Power movement forward were the young activists in CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and Dr. King's organization. When the movement split, what did he do? He embraced Black Power. He didn't deal with the civil rights folks who were more conservative. So this pushed him further and further to the left, more and more radical. And also when he became active in the anti-war movement. These are the factors that moved King to become more and more radical. This is what gets left out of the record 90% of the time. So I'm going to share with you some of the evidence so you can see it for yourself. Now, some of the articles that you might want to know about, we don't have time to cover all of them, but I'll show you some. So next stop, the North. King is not only looking to influence the public in general, but people in the movement and including people in his organization. He's influencing them. He's telling them that it's another phase. It's phase 2. We must go to the North. We must deal with human rights. And this is what he begins to do and push. So his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they had a lot of retreats at Frogmore, South Carolina. This is in the Sea Islands. I didn't know at the time when I was an undergraduate, but that Dr. King chose to have their retreats at Frogmore because that was one of those traditional areas where Black people came from Sierra Leone. They had a link to Africa, the Sea Islands. So he addressed his organization on November 14th, and then he consistently talked about problems of civil rights. Remember now, in '66, he's moved on to human rights. He's a human rights activist. So someone calling him a civil rights activist, they distorted King. They're dealing with King in the early years. He's not dealing with civil rights anymore. He barely even mentioned civil rights after 1965. So it's a great distortion to just call him a civil rights leader. He's more than that. He's focusing on human rights. So let's take a look at some of the evidence. Now his organization, guess what? They're not dealing with civil rights anymore either. King is not out there by himself. What was the annual theme after the Voting Rights Bill was passed in 1965? I'm glad you asked. Let me share with you. Take a look at the theme of the organization. They're not dealing with civil rights anymore. Human rights, basic issues, the Grand Alliance. And what did they do the next year? They doubled down on that. Human rights, the continuing struggle. This is the annual theme of the organization. So how is it that people are only talking about Dr. King and civil rights? That's the media. That's the journalists. That's the biographers who have systematically misrepresented the record. And I'll show you a couple of them and explain exactly what they've done to misrepresent King. I've already showed you Claiborne Carson, a respected scholar, and he's going to fabricate a document and call it the autobiography of Dr. King. He knows better. He should be barred now from being in the scholarly ranks because that's as much of a violation than you could ever think of. It's fraud is what it is. He knows that. Everybody in academia knows that. You don't write somebody else's self-story when they had no intentions of having an autobiography. He never said any materials besides, if I was going to write his quote autobiography, I would have put the essay in there, a testament of hope. How come they didn't put that in there? There's a lot of records I would have put in his quote autobiography. Now take a look at what Dr. King says on December 10th, 1965. This is one of the greatest and most impactful speeches that he gave. He's not dealing with human rights. With civil rights, he's dealing with human rights. Take a look at what he says. He says that we live in an era in which the issue of human rights is the central question confronting all nations. All nations. He's not making an exception for the U.S. And so he condemns the racist apartheid system. He said that they were spectacular savages and called for a support of human rights in South Africa and around the world. But not only that, let me give you another example. The press conference that I mentioned earlier, when Dr. King is no longer focusing on the South, they're no longer focusing on just local issues, but now national and international issues. Here's what he said. Among many things, we are raising the question, you see it, of human rights for those who have been denied these rights by the structures of our society. He's not talking about civil rights anymore. So again, to present him as a civil rights leader is a misrepresentation of King. He's not dealing with that after the Civil Rights Bill and Voting Rights Bills were passed. He's continuously talking about human rights. Take a look at one of the last speeches he gave, Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution. What a title. He said there was a triple revolution, the revolution in technology, in weaponry, and guess what the third one is? You guessed it, a human rights revolution. He makes it very plain. King is growing. He's developing. He's evolving into a very powerful role, and the government is concerned about it because they knew for a fact that they couldn't buy Dr. King off. They couldn't knock him out of his lobby. And as he's become more and more radical, when the hot coals hit his lips, they're very concerned about it. Very concerned. You should read the FBI records, and these people were absolutely pathological in their pursuit to try to destroy Dr. King. Now, he embraces Black power. So the most radical activists in the country embraced Black power in 1966. And King stayed with them. King worked with them. King protected them. And in fact, they swayed King. King preferred Black power as a program, but he didn't like it as a slogan because he said it might remind people of white power. And with white power was violence and a lot of criminality. So King wanted a Black power program under a more palatable name, a softer name. But guess what? He eventually started to argue for and present a Black power program. And he wrote a detailed essay, for example, Black Power Defined. And he also has a section in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? We don't normally read that. So in terms of Black power, the evidence is very clear. These are some of the records here. You can check it out. It's there. But we don't normally associate Dr. King with Black power because those in the Black power movement also embrace, guess what? Self-defense. And King was among them. King said, that's not an issue. That if somebody's being attacked, of course they should defend themselves. He said the issue about guns only came up because the question was whether or not it was tactically wise, whether it was tactically wise to carry a gun or knife in a demonstration. That was the only debate for him, because he knew that if a skirmish took place with the police, then the media is going to focus on the skirmish and the fact that somebody had a weapon, as opposed to the white supremacist system that they were fighting against, where Black people had no rights at all. And so this is what King was talking about, not self-defense. He always defended himself, believe it or not. He had the Deacons for Defense around him in Mississippi. Who are the Deacons for Defense? Armed Black men. Yeah, Black men that were armed and trained. Even the Montgomery bus boycott. Guess who was protecting his house? Armed men. He wasn't crazy. It's the media that's presented this, that you have to go and never protect yourself. King is only dealing with whether or not you should have a weapon in a demonstration. Anyway, so this as a program, take a look at what he says about power. There's nothing essentially wrong with power. The problem is that in America, power is unequally distributed. King is not running from power. So check out his last book, it's there. Look else what he says about power and Blackness. He says Black is beautiful and as beautiful as any other color. So the concept of Black power is something that we are certainly able to understand and accept. He goes on in his book, power is not the white man's birthright. It would not be legislated for us to deliver in neat government packages. It's a social force any group can utilize by accumulating its elements in a planned, deliberate campaign to organize it under its own control. It's clear. I'm reading these, if you just came in, because I already know that somebody will say it ain't so. That's just an opinion. Not at all. Documentation beats conversation. So it's here in black and white. There's tons of sources, and I'm just giving you the surface of it. I wrote a detailed thesis on the revolutionary Martin Luther King, and I'm glad you're here because one who learns must teach. What about supporting armed liberation movements? King embraced armed liberation movements and called for their support. Never once did he say they should change tactics and put the weapons down. He never said that. He never thought that. He felt that those were winnable struggles to kick out the oppressor, to kick out the colonialist. And so he supported them and called for their public support. Here's one that some of you are probably aware of, his Beyond Vietnam speech on April 4th. It was exactly one year to the day to his assassination. Now, some people have misnamed this. They call it a time to break silence, or no, that's a different one. This is Beyond Vietnam. Look at what he says. These are revolutionary times. All over the globe, men are revolting against old systems of exploitation and oppression, and out of the wombs of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. We in the West must support these revolutions. And he called on the U.S. to pay reparations to the to the Vietnamese, because he said the U.S. destroyed the Vietnamese two most cherished institutions, the family and the village, and they must pay. He doesn't say that we should support them, but urge them to demonstrate peacefully. Never. He doesn't think that way, and he never says that. He never intimates that at all. You need more? Check it out. We must be willing to understand why many of the young nations will have to pass through the same extremism, revolution, and aggression that formed our history. Now, how was the U.S. formed? A bloody 8-year American Revolutionary War. The 13 colonies in a bloody 8-year war against the British. This is what he's referring to. This was a young America looking to be born, and they had to fight for their independence. This is exactly what Dr. King is saying. Remember, he's a minister. He's concerned about the barefoot and shirtless people of the world. This is why he embraces them, is not concerned about how they become free. He's more concerned that they do become free. And so now here's what I want to share with you about the great distorters of Dr. King's work. Why it is that what I'm sharing might be new. It's because of a grand scheme. And this is the most gross distortion of King's work that you can imagine. Here you have David Garrow, who wrote Bearing the Cross in the mid-'80s. And this won him a Pulitzer Prize. And here's what you need to know about David Garrow. This is a 700 or 800 page book. So when you look at the book, it seems as though he's very thorough in that when he discusses a king's speech, he might have half a page, 3/4 of a page summarizing the speech. But guess what? He uses ellipsis marks, you know, those 3 dots to skip over things. And he lists, he may list 4 or 5 different references where he's giving more or less the same speech or more or less a similar writing. And so looking at a huge book like that and him summarizing a speech or essay, but he uses the ellipsis marks to skip over the very information that contradicts his summary. So I used David Garrow's Bearing the Cross because I started working on my master's thesis in 1987. So, and one thing I learned from Garrow, and this is absolutely appalling, I learned from him what Dr. King's main focus was. So when I went to the archives at the King Center in Atlanta, and I went to the Mooger Collection at Boston University, and to the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., and combed through all of the records, thousands and thousands of records, Garrow said something that was interesting in his book. He said that the biggest file in the King archives is his file on Africa. So I made a note of that. So I'm looking at the Africa file when I'm in the archives, and guess what? He's right. That Dr. King had all of these news articles and correspondence and letters with revolutionaries who were fighting against white supremacists and white colonists who had taken over their country. But guess what? Garrow makes that statement that it's the biggest file, but guess what? There's not a chapter, a section, or even a page on the thing that Dr. King was most interested in. He's most interested in Africa because Dr. King said that the struggle in Africa and the struggle in among Black people in the U.S., he said it was the same struggle. And he also described it as the same struggle against quote unquote white supremacy and the contempt for life. White supremacy and the contempt for life. That's how he described the similarity and commonality, the commonality about the African liberation struggles and the Black struggle in the U.S. So if this is the biggest file that concerned Dr. King, how could the biography be legitimate when the reader gets no sense of that at all? Why didn't he, if that's such a big file, how come he did not delve into and summarize and explain and analyze it? Because this is distortion. It's a misrepresentation of Dr. King's work. It's a gross distortion. And the same David Garrow, I'll show you his other book, he wrote The FBI and Martin Luther King. I also use that, a very thorough book. He documents that Dr. King is the most surveillance man in the history of the U.S., documents the crimes against Dr. King, and then at the end of his book, I'll show you the book, he says it's irresponsible to say that the FBI had anything to do with his assassination when he himself documents that they had everything to do with it. And the same David Garrow, by the way, wrote an article in 2019. I didn't even pay much attention to it because I already know that his work is about gross distortion of one of the great activists in the 20th century. He wrote an article about Dr. King and supposedly with a bunch of women. What does that have to do with the political work of Dr. King? Why is he writing on that? Because the goal is to minimize King's work. Here you got a guy that is not an activist, had nothing to do with the movement, didn't contribute to the movement, didn't support the movement, but after the movement was over and is safe, a couple of decades later, now he writes the biography that gets a Pulitzer Prize, and now he becomes the so-called King expert. But the King expert is very keen on misrepresenting King. And you will never find anything that would ever show in his work, David Garrow, about how Dr. King embraced revolutionary movements on the African continent and what he did, for example, to embrace revolutionaries in all of the different areas, whether they were in armed struggle in Kenya, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, South Africa, Zimbabwe. Why isn't he writing about that? Because it blows up this idea that King was so against self-defense, so-called violence, that he would have, the assumption is he would not have embraced them. Of course he did. The records are clear. He doesn't write about it. But the distortions don't stop there. Taylor Branch, another guy, problematic. So again, when I'm writing my master's thesis entitled The Revolutionary Martin Luther King, this guy, Taylor Branch, writes his book. He was on the radio in Baltimore, and a 1,000-page book. So he gives it, he's talking on the radio, and I called in and I said, Mr. Branch, I'm listening to you. Can you now talk about the second phase of Dr. King's work? The human rights phase that he writes so much about. Oh, I'm not familiar with that. Second phase. I said, excuse me, sir. You wrote a 1,000-page book. The records are replete with Dr. King embracing human rights and Black power after 1965. What do you mean you're not aware of it? This is, you could not read anything he wrote or listen to what he had to say, or even look at the FBI records and not know that. Oh, well, this is new information. I would like to get your number. So I left my number. I'm still waiting decades later. I've never heard from Taylor Branch. And by the way, Taylor Branch is from Atlanta. And he said that he never met Dr. King. He never went to the office. He never met King because of disinterest. How could there be disinterest when people are being brutalized in racist America? It had no basic rights. So we had no interest during the struggle. Then in the 80s, when the coast is clear, he gets the Pulitzer Prize. He's being promoted as some King expert. So this is what we have. We have a couple of white guys that have been promoted and propped up as experts on King, and their distortions are great and mighty. King would not even recognize his own work with these guys misrepresenting King, which is amazing. Now, finally, I want to end and show you how it ended for King and why he was assassinated as he moved towards a more radical position. The last campaign that he had envisioned was the Poor People's Campaign. Some of you know about that. He said it was the last desperate attempt for nonviolence. He even wrote an article called Showdown for Nonviolence. He thought this was it. He hadn't had a major victory since the Voting Rights Bill in 1965. He said, look, I need victories in order to remain relevant, in order to remain credible. So he envisioned, along with his colleagues, why don't we go and take over Washington, D.C.? And the FBI ramped up the propaganda against King. They said that this man cannot be allowed to enter Washington, D.C. and take over it as was being planned. So King said that give us a few months with this campaign in Washington, D.C. If it doesn't work, he told the Black Power advocates that you all can move forward with any method you think will solve the race problem. Because King said, I don't know. I just experimented that maybe nonviolence can work in America. He wasn't sure. Now, look, what did they want to do? King, he argued for a Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged in the billions. There should be a guaranteed job for everybody, and those that can't work, there should be a guaranteed income in the billions, not only for Black people, but poor in general. They wanted to go to DC and literally shut down Congress and engage in what he called the dislocation of cities all across the country. In other words, there'll be no vehicular traffic into the capital area and no foot traffic, no pedestrian traffic into the capital area, and that they would tie up the phones and make sure it would not be business as usual until the poor were addressed and taken care of in this massive Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged. So they were going to occupy DC. They had about 3,000 people that were going to invade DC and set up Resurrection City. And then the FBI started to leak more and more articles to the media to say that there's going to be a bloodbath in DC, that Dr. King is irresponsible. Dr. King must be stopped. He's setting up a bloodbath. And the FBI was bent on making sure that this never took place. This was scheduled for late April of 1968. And if you remember what I said earlier, maybe you just know it in general, Dr. King was assassinated on April 4th. He never got to this campaign, but this led directly to his assassination. And the FBI was intimately involved in it, pretty well documented by various sources, including David Garrow himself. So this is his last desperate attempt for nonviolence. He didn't know if it would work, but he felt that this was the best shot at it to solve the vicious race problem in America. And so let me end by sharing with you a few other things. This was his final challenge. This is what King said. This is what upset the FBI and the government. By the way, the government felt that Dr. King was the #1 threat to the US government. Not Malcolm, not others, but it was King, because they knew that he had a huge following and they couldn't buy him off. They couldn't knock him out of his lobby. This is what Dr. King said, and he meant it. Either Black people are granted freedom in this country, or he'll have to be exterminated. That's the choice. And that's the position that he never moved from. And the government was concerned that this man must be stopped because they track everything he did. So finally, what was the FBI campaign against King? This is the greatest campaign ever. They had the surveillance on Dr. King was so tight over the 6-year period that he couldn't even wiggle. Literally, everything was wiretapped. The FCLC telephones wiretapped. His home phone was wiretapped. Microphones in the hotels and the motels. FBI informants in the organization, including a Black student, Harrison, who was given live information about what was happening in the headquarters there in Atlanta. And J. Edgar Hoover's the one that created this Destroy King campaign. And not only that, but take a look. When Dr. King won the Nobel Peace Prize, J. Edgar Hoover went on the offensive and said he's the most notorious liar. He said that King is one of the lowest types in the country. And he went after King with a vicious campaign. And they wanted to make sure that Dr. King did not move forward with that poor people's campaign. And they did everything they could. J. Edgar Hoover was a criminal and created a criminal operation to go after Dr. King. And so this is part of that vicious approach. So they wrote this letter. One of the FBI agents flew to Florida and sent the letter from Florida to King's home in Atlanta. It was unsigned. It was in late 1964. And they said, and so they didn't sign it, these cowards. They tried to make it seem like it was a Black person, said, you know, that he could have been a leader of our movement. It's not a Black person. They wouldn't write like this. But King, look into your heart. You know you are a complete fraud and a great liability to all us Negroes. Yeah, right. King, like all frauds, your end is approaching. And they go on, no person can overcome facts, not even a fraud like yourself. So they're attacking him. And they called him an animal. And then here at the end, King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days in which to do it. And so in other words, they thought that they would get Dr. King to commit suicide, which is absurd. And then the FBI, these white men, they thought that if they can get King to commit suicide, they had some guy on the sideline that they thought was going to replace King. How out of touch were they? Completely out of touch. And along with this ridiculous letter that they sent, they also sent a tape. It was garbled. Nobody knew what the tape was. And they sent it to King and his wife and tried to break the man's family up, try to get him to commit suicide. Hoover was sick. top law enforcement guy was one breaking the law. Now, take a look at the book here. David Garrow documents the criminality of J. Edgar Hoover and then claims that the FBI had nothing to do with his assassination. They had everything to do with it. So the campaign continued. It was shocking to learn just about 14 years ago that even the great photographer, Ernest Withers, was now outed as an informant of the FBI for about 14 years, informant of the FBI. This was shocking. A great civil rights photographer was also part of the campaign, not only the Black student that I mentioned to you, Harrison, but they also had a famed photographer also giving human intelligence to the FBI about King and the movement. Now, finally, the counterintelligence program, which many of you are familiar with. It's a 15-year criminal program where the FBI broke every law imaginable to violate all kinds of civil liberties, but this was under the direction of Hoover. So what I want to share with you about this criminal program that was orchestrated to destroy the Black movement and all other movements in the 60s and 70s. And so it was to go after leaders, help assassinate leaders, to get groups that were fighting against each other, to make sure they had no credibility. But take a look at the goals that Hoover wrote in August of 1967, the goals of the counterintelligence program. Goal number 2, to prevent the rise of a Messiah who could unify and electrify the Black militant movement. Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, and Elijah Muhammad all aspired to this position. Wow. Now, they don't mention Malcolm X because Malcolm had already been assassinated. And they mentioned that Malcolm would have been such a person who would aspire to this position, but he was a martyr. But they were very concerned about Dr. King. After he gave his I Have a Dream speech, the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover and William Sullivan, they said that Dr. King was the biggest threat in the country. Now, if you wanted to villainize somebody, you just call him a communist. Just like today you call him they called a terrorist, then is a communist. He was always called a communist, and this is why the FBI had so many people in the white public who were with them, who would send all kind of things to the FBI to maybe help to get rid of this so-called communist. But anyway, so I've shared a lot with you, but King clearly is somebody who embraced human rights. He embraced armed liberation struggles, and he certainly embraced Black power as well. And so he's no longer dealing with civil rights. He's not even focused on integration, folks, at all. His whole life, you take a look at Dr. King's life, his family was all Black. The church, Ebenezer Baptist Church, was all Black. His organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was all Black. And he lived in the Auburn Avenue area of Atlanta, which was all Black. Every aspect of his life is all Black. There's no integration. So what we think we know is not accurate. So this is what Dr. King challenges everybody to do. He says, few people have the toughness of mind to judge critically and to discern the truth from the false, the fact from fiction. The soft-minded man always fears change. For him, the greatest pain is the pain of a new idea. And that's the great challenge, is to take what's been shared with you and embrace and liberate Dr. King's legacy from the clutches of gross misrepresentation and fraudulent presentation of what he was about. So this is just a snapshot of the revolutionary Dr. King, the evolution of a revolutionary. I'm Professor Manu Ampim, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's what I was about to say. That certainly was a captivating presentation and leaves a lot to chew on, Dr. Ampim. So I know everybody, I can see the crowd is applauding right now. Very, very thought-provoking. And I know Dr. Ampim was very big on interaction. And so I think we have time for a few questions if anybody has that. While we do, it's one thing I do want you to tell them, Dr. Ampim. Now, this isn't pertaining to Dr. King, but would you tell them how you discovered the Willie Lynch letter was a hoax?
Okay, appreciate it. Yeah, that's part of my work as well. One of the greatest myths in the Western Hemisphere among Black folks is the so-called Willie Lynch letter. It's supposedly in 1712, a white British slave owner who was in the Caribbean allegedly went to Virginia and gave a speech on how to control Black people for the next 300 years. And people think that this fraudulent speech is somehow legitimate. Well, as a trained historian, I knew it didn't make any sense because, first of all, this speech, which people call a letter, made references that didn't make any sense at all. For example, Willie Lynch never mentions where he's from. He just said his modest plantation in the West Indies. People didn't speak like that. But even more than that, he makes reference to King George. King George had been dead for 100 years. Queen Anne was in charge of Britain at the time. So that didn't make any sense. Not only that, but in addition to that, that in early 1700s, there was no such thing. Black people were not being lynched. They could be killed if they ran away. They would be beheaded, but they weren't lynched. This was after the Civil War. So I wrote. Somebody wanted me to present on this. So I presented on Death for the Willie Lynch speech, and I posted it online. Next thing I know, Dr. Kwabena Asante called me and confessed that he was the one who wrote the original fake Willie Lynch letter in the late 1970s. And he said that they created a lot of fake documents because they didn't have a study group in Durham, North Carolina. So they would just create what they thought might be accurate. So he didn't think anything of it until he heard it at the Million Man March being mentioned. And then he came across my essay when I said that it had to be a brother who was in his 20s or 30s, who didn't know much about US or African-American history. And that's who wrote it. And why brother? Because women are typically not that aggressive. People in their 20s or 30s, they don't have better things to do with their time. So I knew it was somebody younger. And I knew he didn't take much class. So he said that when he read that, there was a brother in his 20s or 30s who didn't really know much about US or African-American history. Shante said, damn, the brother got me. And so
it was even some of the language in that. If you look, some of that language is today's language. It wasn't something that would be written back in, 300 years ago.
Absolutely. He didn't even spell words correctly. He used the American spelling of color instead of the British spelling, which would have been a U, COLOUR. So many things like that clearly wasn't legitimate. And so Shanti came forward and wrote a confession letter. Yeah, but it's nothing like primary research to draw out fraudulent material.
Correct. We have a question here from Leona. Leona?
Yes. Yes, sir. Peaceful greetings, everyone. My name's Leona. Thank you for your presentation, Professor, and thank you, Unity Group, for doing this. Listen, I have two quick questions, if you don't mind, sir. Now, back to that book, the quote-unquote autobiography of Dr. Martin Luther King by Claiborne Carson and Mrs. Coretta Scott King. I'm just curious. What is the possibility that the publishers or the editors might have slapped that name on there versus Claiborne Carson or Mrs. King? I don't know much about the publishing business, but I know sometimes they do things that the writers don't want them to do. That's one question. And the other question I have right quick is back in May of 2018, Professor A. Peter Bailey came to Michigan, the Charles H. Wright Museum. He gave a talk about the shared concepts of Brother Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I was present, and Professor Bailey allowed me to video tape or videograph his talk, and I did that. And recently he allowed me to make it public on YouTube, and it's out there. So I was just going to say that if anyone, if with your permission, if anybody's interested in looking at that, I could drop the link in the chat. That was it. Thank you.
Okay, those are some good points. The first point is a good point, that a lot of times the editors will, or the publisher, they will change the title. So that's a good point. That does happen. In this case, is highly unlikely because the King family and Coretta Scott King had such tight control over everything. It's unusual and concerning. So like I did research at the King Center. Most people don't know that the archives are upstairs because every researcher regardless of their perspective on King. Somebody's looking to liberate Dr. King's legacy, as I am, or those that want to peddle the dream, all agree that it is difficult to get anything done because they don't want you to do research there and have any independent ideas. So little things like just go on an extended lunch so you can't order any documents to look at. You had to wait for the archivist to come back, and then when she comes back, it's almost time to close. Little things like that. But I point one other thing out about the family control over everything King is that you know that there's a monument of Dr. King in Washington, D.C. You know, there's a King monument like there is for Jefferson and Lincoln and Washington. But guess what? The King family is the only family that said, look, if you want to put a likeness or a statue of Dr. King in DC near the mall, you need to pay. Huh? It's usually a great honor to be publicized in that manner, but not the King Center. They tried to monetize even that. They control everything. And if you're not familiar with the background with the King family, they've split over what should be done with Dr. King's paraphernalia. You know, the sister and the brothers, the one brother just passed, Dexter, but they've been fighting for years over Dr. King's legacy. Should his legacy be presented accurately, or should we just make money? Because the dream sells. You know, the dream sells. The family has been taking in money and bringing George Bush and Ronald Reagan to celebrate King's birthday when these men fought their whole life to undermine everything King did. Why did they have him come to Atlanta to participate in the dream celebration? Because the dream sells. So the family, however, they've always been totally in control of everything King. So it's a good point that she's making in general, but in case with the King family, it is highly unlikely that anybody would have changed the title that they didn't want. And so Claiborne Carson and the late Coretta Scott King, they know better, but they wanted to present a certain image of Dr. King, and they must be held accountable for that, because ultimately it's the records of Dr. King that belongs to the King Center and the family. And if a publisher or editor wanted to change it or it's beyond recognition of what the work's about, they could have said no. And that's why contracts are signed, so that nobody can just take your work and do what they want when they want to do it, the way they want to do it. So we must hold accountable Claiborne Carson, who knows better, and also Coretta King, that has to know better than to distort the man's record. And clearly Malcolm and Martin had more in common than they had in conflict. So when Malcolm X went down to Selma on March the 3rd, 1965, it was to form an alliance with Dr. King. 2.5 weeks later, Malcolm was assassinated. The government was very concerned about that union and that working together, because King and Malcolm have been a formidable force together, and they knew that. So they had far more in common, but people don't look at the last phase of Malcolm carefully enough, and they certainly don't look at the last phase of Dr. King carefully enough. So distortions take place on both sides.
I know Reverend Ann Pierre has her hand up. Reverend Pierre.
Good evening to everyone. Very informative. Thank you very much. Just a comment first. I worked for the federal government for 30 years. Not only did J. Edgar Hoover have control over everything in our communities, he had control over every top official for every organization, every office in the U.S. government. Anybody that reported had to turn in a budget, he controlled them, and he had information on everybody. And he could control the whole situation. The Wall Street Journal did an excellent article about him, or I guess expose, it was very long, about him and his life. So if anybody hasn't read that, they might want to go check out the Wall Street Journal. I don't exactly remember the year they did it, but they did very extensive. But then this is my question. I know that when Dr. King was working more in civil rights and even starting with the march at Riches in Atlanta, that he always had a group of people that worked with him. Can you talk just some about the people who work with him as he moved toward human rights being the key point?
Yeah, I appreciate that. You know, there had been a lot of people, a lot of ministers, Lafayette and Bevels and even Jackson, Jesse Jackson, Ralph Abernathy, Andrew Young. A lot of people in the organization work with King, and they helped to found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But as King started to focus on human rights, he embraced more of the radical activists in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So he worked with Stokely Carmichael, for example. He worked with Willie Ricks. Now he's Brother Mukasa. And Stokely Carmichael became Kwame Ture. He started working with those young activists, H. Rap Brown and others who were embracing Black Power, presenting Black Power. And there's an interesting video where during the Black Power March in June of 1966 in Mississippi, it was a white reporter in the middle, and there was Stokely Carmichael on one side and Dr. King on the other. As they were walking down the road, they were pretty much working out and subtly debating about Black Power. So the reporter, you know how they are, they put it in Dr. King's face. What did you think about that, Doctor? Oh, what do you think, Stokely? And so you see that so it was the young activists who were pushing Dr. King. King agreed that there needed to be power, but he didn't like the term initially Black Power. You know, he said, why are you all talking about power? Just organize for power. But then you find that they were pushing Dr. King. And so when the SNCC activists, when they said at one of the rallies at the Black Power March, one of the nights, Stokely Carmichael and Willie Ricks, they said, let's do it. So they sprung the phrase on everybody at the rally. Say, what do you want? Then the audience said, Black Power. What do you want? Black Power. So King was caught in this. King was engulfed in this movement to acquire power to change and control the Black community and to defend the Black community from the American and white nationalists and white supremacists. So he's working more and more with the young activists, and he's working less and less with A. Philip Randolph and Dorothy Height and Whitney Young and Bayard Rustin. He's not focused, he's not working with them anymore. In fact, King wanted to separate from them because these people took out a statement to condemn Black Power. This was in October of 1966. They took out they had a press conference to condemn Black Power. King wasn't there. One of the reporters said, what does Dr. King think about the statement? And they tried to make it seem like Dr. King agreed with their anti-Black Power statement. And King was upset. He was asking his advisors how to deal with this. And then guess what? Dr. King took out a full-page ad in the New York Times. And you know what he said? Dr. King clarifies his stance. He's not against the Black Power. He said this is a real call of anger. And so when people were rising up, Dr. King was protecting them, working with them, secretly meeting with them in Washington, D.C. And now it turns out it wasn't so secret because the FBI had everything wiretapped. But the government tried to bring in Dr. King to help put down this radical new movement, and he embraced them. He was never against them. And so that's who King started to work more and more with, those that were coming more and more radical, moving further and further to the left. And there was a split in the movement between the radical activists and Dr. King on the one hand, and the more conservative people on the other, like John Lewis. John Lewis wanted no part of that. And so that's why he left SNCC. Exactly why he left SNCC. So.
Yeah, we actually had
By the way, I'm sorry, I should say this. And I won't go into details, but King also was a part of two organizations, the American Committee on Africa and also the American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa. Those two organizations publicly and without hesitation or reservation called for the support of armed liberation struggles in Africa, and King was a prominent member of those two groups.
Yeah, and I know we had Papa Ricks a few years ago, so he came to tell us how that slogan of Black Power got started. We actually should have invited him to one and only Mikasa Dada.
Mikasa Dada, you're right, my brother. And they took the phrase Black Power for Black People, and then Brother Mikasa, because that was being used by John Lewis and a lot of people in SNCC, Black Power for Black People. And then it was Brother Mukasa who reduced it from that phrase to just Black Power. And he told Stokely, man, we got to hit him with Black Power. So, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, to hear Papa Ricks talk about that, it's a fascinating story in itself. And now maybe one or two more questions. And I see Leona has her hand up again. Very quickly, please.
Peaceful greetings, Leona again. Listen, if somebody else has their hand up, they can go ahead. I just wanted to say quickly that I did drop that link in the chat. I hope it's okay with your permission. And I was just wondering, that year, 1965, because this month, a few days ago, there was the 59th anniversary of the assassination of Brother Malcolm X. And I'm wondering, and King switched gears in 1965 as well. Any relation, you think? And also, will there be a replay of this particular video? Thank you.
Well, yes, being recorded. Yes, there's a direct relationship between Malcolm being assassinated in 1965 and him embracing Dr. King and the movement. When Malcolm left the Nation of Islam in '64, he felt that he was free to do what he wanted to do. Malcolm had always had a desire to work with those who were in the civil rights movement. But Ella Baker said, hey, Malcolm, don't be naive. These people are not progressive. You can maybe work with the more progressive or radical folks in the civil rights movement, but you can't work with all of them. But that was Malcolm's desire for years. So when he was no longer in the Nation of Islam, he certainly went down, and he went down there to inform Dr. King that he was with them, that if the government and the racists down in Selma and other places did not meet the demands of Dr. King and the movement, then they would have to face Malcolm. That was done on purpose. And Malcolm articulated that, and the government was well aware that this is very dangerous for them. And by the way, I'm going to put this in the chat. I didn't mention to you, to show you how sick the FBI is and was, to go to the archives to find all of the materials on King and the movement. You have to go to Communist Influence in Racial Matters. That's the file. They felt that the only reason why Dr. King and others were organizing and protesting and demonstrating and challenging the white supremacist Jim Crow system in America is because of outside agitators. They didn't think that Black people had a legitimate reason to protest anything. And it was the communists that were influencing King and others. So the file is Communist Influence in Racial Matters. And then you have to go to a sub-file called Black Nationalist Hate Groups. Black Nationalist Hate Groups. So the FBI classified all of them as hate groups. The Nation of Islam, the Republic of New Africa, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Congress of Racial Equality, NAACP, all of them. Even the American Indian Movement, you name the organization, the Latino organizers, they all were in the hate group category, and that's how the FBI saw things. So, yes, Sister Lynn.
We have about 5 more minutes in this session, Dr. Ampim.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Professor Manu. I'm really happy to have been able to listen to your talk today, and I'm just really grateful that you mentioned Dr. King meeting at in Gullah Country. I was just in South Carolina at the Penn Center.
Yeah.
And they were telling me when I was there that Dr. King met there. And so I got this book, and this talks about those 1966 meetings that he had there on St. Helena Island in
Wow.
Gullah country. So yeah, that was where he retreated and where he gave those statements about being past the civil rights period and into the human rights period. So thank you.
Wow, that's great. Yeah, thank you for that. We appreciate that, Dr. Morrow. That's important information. Yes. And King worked 20-hour days. So you might say, well, where did he even get time to publish those 5 books? Well, he would always go to Jamaica at the end of the year or early January he went to Jamaica for some R&R, rest, relaxation, and reflection. That's what he did, and he wrote his books, one of the great activists. So be careful what's being presented because it is totally fraudulent on King. Now is a new book, Jonathan Ng. He's now the next expert on King. Another white guy who's an expert of the Black struggle. How about that? And Black folks are the ones that have given these people this kind of platform. It's crazy.
Dr. Brian, we have to be very quickly.
I'm sorry, brother.
We have to be very quickly, Dr. Brian.
Okay.
All right, it's a short question. Where do we begin, Dr. Ampim, if we want to start on this journey of discovery as you did on Dr. King? Give me a book that I can particularly use with my high school students, where we can begin to look at it.
Yes, sir. Okay, thank you. All right, this is what I would say. This is my book, by the way. Y'all can, my History of African Civilizations. So this is part of my work. You can get it from us, Advancing the Research. I think it's in the chat, advancingtheresearch.org. So this is my book. But in terms of Dr. King, where I would start with is, let's see. Let me show you the books. What I would definitely do is stay away from these. These should be banned because you should read the first-hand material and then look at these because the distortions are great and mighty. But probably this is what I would recommend for the books. I would recommend that good place to start would be where do you go from here? Or where do we go from here? And also a testament of hope, because here there's a number of articles, interviews, excerpts from books, and you can use different materials, depends on what you're sharing with the students. So if I had to boil it down, I would say these 2 sources would probably be the first materials to share with the students.
All right, and we know that we could talk all night when you get going on this. Now, if anybody wants to Dr. Ampim, it's almost time you go to Africa again, isn't it? 'Cause I know you lead several tours.
Yes.
Because he is a chematologist. If anybody doesn't understand what that is the study of the origins of Africa. And not have those misrepresentations. So I know it's a lot of information. So we can go to Advancing the Research. Is that right? I know Minister Ronald's on here. Advancing the Research, is that where they can find you best, Professor Ampim?
Yeah,
I've actually put in the direct links to information about the tours, both the Kemet tour as well as the Ethiopia tour. But yes, you can also go to advancingtheresearch.com to get information as well. But the direct links are in the chat.
Okay, and with that, Dr. Ampim, any closing words?
Well, I would say that now that the information has been given, then I would just encourage people to challenge those around us and stop the spread of information viruses regarding Dr. King. So he embraced liberation movements. He was not focused on just civil rights. He went beyond that. And he certainly embraced Black power and sought to implement it so that Black people can control their own communities. So that's what folks should get from it, and not this thing about a dream. Dreaming about what exactly? No, he's wide awake as a practical activist. So that's what I would say, is that it's really important that we really see his evolutionary growth, particularly after 1965. So that's what I would share.
All right, and with that, we'll continue to collaborate with Professor Ampim in the future. It's a long list of topics that he can cover, so we're sure that we can find something that you might enjoy. And we appreciate everybody being here on a Friday afternoon to get this sort of response on a Friday evening here. Means that you are very interested in the subject, and we have to be the vanguards of the legacy of not only Dr. King but all of our ancestors now. And that's what some of the older professors
Ashe.
and teachers that have gone on, Dr. Clark and Dr. Ben and Leonard Jeffries, and you had a good teacher too, Dr. Amping, in your undergraduate studies. And so the
Yeah.
work of the real historians is very important, and we should salute them and support them on what they do.
Thank you, Brother Eric. I appreciate it.
With that, everybody, we'll bid you good night. We will see you on the back end.